All right, let's get going. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another session of the Cerini Connection. I'm Ken Cerini, and I'm super excited for all of you guys to join us here today. We have a really important and incredible topic today. We're going to be talking about navigating risk and strengthening internal controls. Risk management internal controls are critical to any organization, no matter what type. Having the right processes in place can mean the difference between long-term stability and unexpected challenges. So it's kind of really important to make sure that you've got a proper system of internal controls in place so that you're mitigating risk through those controls and being able to kind of navigate through all of that stuff. And today, I'm really excited to have Erin Teta with us, who's one of the directors here in our the internal controls and internal audit department at Cerini Associates, and Adam Brigandi, who is a supervisor within that same department. So they're going to be here talking about internal controls. I do ask that if anybody has any questions as we're going through this, please just drop your questions in the chat. It's a lot easier for me to track the chat than the Q&A. So again, drop them in. We want to try to make this as interactive as possible. I know it's hard to do in a kind of a format like this, but if anybody does have any questions, please put them in the chat. If people want to say who you are and start talking and get conversations going, if someone says something that you get excited about, I know I will be, drop some comments in the chat. So let's make this as interactive as possible. So Erin, Adam, thanks for joining me today, and let's get started. So what do you see as maybe some of the most common risks out there in the business environment?
I would say that basically, no matter the organization type, nonprofits, the education world, businesses, they all face some very similar risks. It's just a matter of what the stakes look like that may be unique to the type of organization. So, for example, one of our biggest risks would be financial mismanagement. And, for a not-for-profit, that could be using funds for things other than what's intended, right? A donor gives you a restricted donation, you're using it for something that you're not supposed to. In higher ed or in a private school, for example, you could be misallocating grant research money. In public schools, they could have procurement breakdowns, they could waste taxpayer dollars. And in businesses, it could even be something like overspending on marketing or operational inefficiencies, things like that. Another common risk that a lot of organizations face on different levels is reputational damage. And you know that in today's world, a scandal can be far-reaching, right? It's failing to meet your mission, it's bad press, and it takes a long time to come back from a reputational type of scandal. If you think back to 2015, the Wounded Warrior Project, that issue that happened where they found out that they were accused of lavish spending instead of focusing on the veterans, and that ended up causing a massive drop in donations. So it could take years to rebuild an organization after something like that. And then you also want to look at compliance issues. That's big. So if you get a grant or if there's regulations surrounding a tax exempt status or fundraising and you get into some legal trouble, right? That could be a problem. In education, if you're not following accreditation standards or you're failing to protect student data, that would be another compliance type issue. But it all comes down to like managing your finances and protecting your reputation. You want to stay compliant and you want to take care of your people. And they're always lurking, the risks, right? But it's about good management and internal controls, controlling what you can, and then just keeping it in check.
Yeah,
And I'll just add on
go ahead.
quickly to that. Another big factor is cybersecurity. In the current environment, everything is online, right? We're all connected today through technology. We're on the Zoom right now. It's impossible to avoid cybersecurity issues. So you just have to be cognizant of that and train your staff, make sure that they're, attuned and watch out for like phishing emails or any other type of scams. Secure your data. Make sure, if you're kind of sending data back and forth, that you're doing it securely, that you have locked down, Wi-Fi networks, put a password on it. Just try to do your best, even if you have limited resources, to just really lock down your IT.
And one of the things that I'm a big proponent on is I love it when organizations or businesses or whatever create risk committees where they actually go in and bring together different people within the organization or within the company to kind of look at and evaluate the various risks that exist within the organization, and then go through and really start looking at, what does the organization have by way of things to mitigate those risks. What have you seen in terms of risk committees within some of your clients and stuff?
I mean, one thing that we always do, I think the first question we ask when we meet with well, first of all, what is a committee, right? So you want to grab all of the key people from all aspects of the organization, right? It's not just the guys all the way up at the top, because they're not really part of the day to day. They might not see things as quickly as someone who's actually in the operations doing it. So you want to make sure that you have the right committee set up, people that have eyes and ears in all areas of the organization. And then the first question is really, what keeps you up at night, right? What is it that you think about? What can go wrong? And having those kinds of discussions. And then after you're done identifying what those risks are unique to your organization, it's okay, what are we currently doing to mitigate that risk? What can we do, right? What do we have to accept? And having those kinds of conversations, and not just like once, but having them on a regular basis, because risk is always changing, it's always evolving.
So what should organizations do to try to mitigate some of that risk? And maybe even how do they identify what those various risks are? I know you said, go through that question of what keeps me up at night, but how do they identify, how do they mitigate risk?
Right. So, fun fact, that the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners said that the typical organization loses about 5% of its annual revenue to fraud. So beyond the loss of fraud, like that is reputational loss, and that can end up costing you more. So it is definitely something that an organization should stop and focus on, even when things are, busy or resources are low. And it has to do with proactively identifying and mitigating risks before, right? It's staying ahead of the game. It's about spotting potential problems before they become a big issue that spirals out of control. And you're going to do that first by starting with a risk assessment, right? So you create a risk assessment. It's like I would look at it as like a health checkup for your organization, right? You're going to sit down with your team. You're going to take a look at all the things that could possibly go wrong, and you come up with a plan for each one of those risks. So, for example, if I were a not-for-profit, right, I might look at the way that we receive funding. And if I see that I get a lot of my funding from just a few major donors, I mean, that's a risk in itself, right? If I were to lose one of those donors, it would seriously hurt the organization. So you recognize that kind of vulnerability, and then you look at, how could we mitigate that? Or maybe we're going to look to start diversifying our funding sources to kind of tamper that risk instead of putting all of our eggs in one basket, so to say. But then also it's about building strong internal controls, right? And your internal controls can be all different types. You have your preventative controls that you put in place to make sure nothing can ever happen. And then you have what's called detective controls, where, if it gets through the cracks, you're catching it before it becomes something big. So that starts with making sure that your organization has clear procedures in place for things like financial transactions, handling sensitive data, and managing your staff. Take, for example, if a school district, right? We just saw the big power school issue and whatnot. Schools have a lot of student information. And if their data systems aren't secure, to Adam's point, that could be a disaster if there's a breach, right? So there's what we can control and what we can't control. If the school is taking steps to make sure that they have strong IT policies, right? If they're managing access to permissions for certain systems that have different types of PII, and maintaining strong management vendor controls, and doing regular audits, they can protect that information to the best of their ability. And then also, yep, go ahead.
I was just going to add quickly to your point before, this shouldn't just be something that happens at the top of the organization. It should be like a collaborative process. So like another important thing is just employee education, making them aware of all these factors too, because like you said before, they're the people, they're the boots on the ground. So they might have a different lens than management in terms of these different risks. So if you educate them on all the different, processes and prevention tactics, they can kind of generate different ideas than people at the top.
100%, right? It's like it's creating a culture of awareness. It's not just saying, oh, we need to do this, right? It's about empowering your staff and asking people to speak up if they see something that could be risky to an organization, like an open door kind of policy for discussing concerns. It's not about so much waiting for the storm to hit. It's having an umbrella so that you're ready, right? It's, you got to look at it like that. And that's what controls are going to do for you.
All right, so you've been talking about controls, right? So all organizations have some level of controls, but what constitutes, how do you differentiate strong controls or a strong control environment from weak controls, and how often should organizations be looking at evaluating their control environment so that they know that whether their controls are weak or strong?
Joanna, so I would look at controls. Think of your organization like a car, right? And internal controls are your brakes, they're your steering wheel, they're your seat belts, right? And they're going to help guide an organization and prevent it from veering off track, right? And getting into an accident. And there's some, strong controls. For example, segregation of duties is one. And there are some key controls. How often you should review them would be, I would say, anytime there's big change within an organization, anytime that there's a lot of turnover, right? Anytime maybe there's changes within different rules and regulations in your industry, and as a baseline, once a year. It doesn't have, it's something that should be ongoing. It's not something that you do once, you set it up and you walk away, because risks are always changing, they're always evolving. So there are some like key components to strong internal controls, the basics basically. And one of them is segregation of duties, right? So it's just kind of a common sense thing. It's about not letting one person have too much control about any, regarding any single process, right? So if you have someone who's handling cash, it shouldn't also be the person recording the cash within the system, or the person that's doing the bank reconciliation at the end of the month, right? And this one, it's like we go in and we do audits. The first recommendation is always, do you have documented policies and procedures? And if you don't, it's like right at them. It's like recommendation number one. Yep. And this is something that our clients are always like, yeah, when we get the time, because it seems so, it just doesn't seem like a big deal, but it really is, right? Because knowing what the rules are means everyone can follow them. and having a clear process for something like approving purchases or how to handle donations. If people know steps and they know what's expected, you have less errors, you have less mismanagement. Just recently we did an audit of a recreation department, right? And it was as simple as they didn't have documented cash handling procedures and policies in place. Seems simple. You collect money, you bring it to the bank, you write it, you put it into your accounting system. But what happened was you have a department that offers different things in all different areas, and you had about 10 different collection spots. And every one of those collection areas had a different way of handling the cash, recording the cash. Everything was so decentralized that there was really no oversight at all. And that's going to expose you to cash mishandling, right? There could be theft, there could be error. You wouldn't know if you don't know what you're recording, what needs to be recorded, what might be missing. How do you run an organization that way? So we even had, it was as simple as there was a time when one of the areas had a very large cash balance on hand sitting in a locker. And the reason being was the person who normally takes the donation to the bank was on medical leave. So think about the exposure, right, to the department. Whereas if you have something like, a process that's documenting who should be in charge of deposits in absence of XYZ, you don't run into a problem like that, and you don't have that kind of risk. So it really is, it seems simple, and it is time consuming, but it's important. And one thing I always say when they push back is it doesn't have to be like fancy. It's more about, come in on a Monday and have all your key employees that run, the different processes within your organization, write down what they did in the morning. And then at the end of the day, have them write down what they did throughout the day. And then on Friday, come back, take a look. Was anything missing? Right. And eventually everything's documented, but it took 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there. It doesn't have to be something that's so time consuming and, and such a big deal, but the value that you can get out of just getting it down, it is huge.
Yeah, Erin, you mentioned the need to evaluate risk or reevaluate risk at least on an annual basis. And Adam, this might be a question for you, but there are times that things happen over the course of the year that could create a new avenue of risk because something changed. Adam, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And then quickly before I cover that, I just wanted to touch back on the importance of documenting the policies and procedures. That's also important too because of, staff turnover. We've been to so many organizations, particularly the school districts, right? It's kind of just a fact of life, I guess you want to say. A lot of the employees are baby boomers, right? Baby boomers are retiring. So you're going to have new people coming in who don't really understand all of the, responsibilities that the previous employees had. So if you have something documented to go through and detail all that, then, you have better business continuity. So that's another reason that it's important to document the policies and procedures, for new employees.
Yeah.
And then in terms of, new IT and just keeping your policies updated, IT is changing all the time. So you want to be aware of kind of any new regulations. There's a lot of different ones, like for personal privacy. They're not necessarily new, but like HIPAA, FERPA, or EdLaw 2D. You want to make sure that personal information is protected. So you just want to constantly be on the lookout for new IT regulations. Make sure you update your policies and procedures for that. Again, cybersecurity. That there's always different like phishing attacks. We've seen at organizations, vendor emails will get spoofed, and they'll send out new routing information, like bank routing information to make payments to. So you want to make sure that you update your policies and procedures for that. Make a detailed process where you're confirming with the vendor if they send you new routing information. It should be on the invoice it should be on the invoice, whatever routing information is on there. If you get an email that contradicts that, just have your employees pick up the phone, call the vendor, confirm that that's actually the correct information. And then, the phishing attacks, they're constantly just looking to social engineer and get in somebody's email address, right? You click the wrong link, and all of a sudden they have access to somebody's account, and then they could even silently go up the hierarchy in the company. They could start at a rank and file employee, and then they can move their way up, and all of a sudden, they have like a management level account that they could do, whatever they want with. So I guess, yeah, it's just about, making sure that you stay updated with any new laws and regulations or different threat vectors, and you updating your policies and procedures kind of accordingly.
Yeah, I think for part of that, we were saying, in terms of, frequency and need to reassess risk. I mean, there are a lot of factors that come into play, right? I mean, new employees, new policies implemented, new software implemented, external factors, changing regulations and laws. All of those things are going to create changes that you have to adapt and adopt to.
Right. Yeah, I mean, think about COVID. No one could have guessed that was going to happen and what that did to organizations.
We do have a question where someone is asking about debit card transactions and credit card transactions. What sort of controls should be in place to oversee and manage those? Any insight there?
Okay. I mean, I think first of all, you always think about who should have a credit card, right? That would be the first look at that kind of area. Only those that actually need it for the job should have access to it, right? And then what are you doing to vet the kinds of purchases that are being made with the cards? So do your policies require that they give you original documentation? What kind of support should be included in order for it to be approved? This is a scenario where the money's already been spent, and if you have a card that's in the name of the organization, you're kind of in a tough spot because if you're not paying your bill, that's going to negatively affect the credit of your organization, right? But you do need to have some kind of, I would say, approval and review process in place that looks specifically at each payment. You're not just taking the credit card statement and paying the total balance due. You're doing a deep dive into each of the expenditures on there, knowing who made the purchase, what the purchase was for, that the purchase was made in accordance to your purchasing policies, and that they had the proper approvals in place. So you're not going to give up all of those, different controls that you would have, let's say, if you were writing a check to a vendor just because you're using a credit card. But yeah, your risk is increased because, someone can basically spend up to whatever limit your card is, right? And as an organization, you need to pay the bill. So, you want to make sure you have as many upfront controls as possible regarding access and what's considered an allowable expense before you grant someone access to a card.
Yeah, there's also, again, with technology always changing, there's apps now where you can actually not only limit the amount, you could limit the specific vendors. You could kind of set specific vendors and
Yes.
kind of authorize those and make sure that the charges can only be used for those specific vendors.
Yeah,
Um,
there are certain credit cards that have those built-in controls that, they need to get a funneled approval to somewhere, but that's specific to a card. But
Yeah,
it is
well, no,
available.
there's programs I think like Expensify and things like that that allow some of that stuff to happen.
Yeah, it
So
might be worth
cool.
looking into.
Um, I know we've been talking about controls, and Erin, you mentioned earlier that you have segregation of duties, and at times controls can be expensive. So,
Right.
how does a small company create or adopt a strong control environment when they have limited resources?
So this is definitely a challenge that many small organizations face. And lots of times when Adam and I go in and we do an audit, the first thing they come back with is, how do you write us up for segregation of duties if we only have two people in the business office, right? And I get it. And it is definitely a challenge, but you don't always have to have a big budget or a big team or fancy software to have solid internal controls. It's about being smart with what you have. So I think it's splitting up tasks, right? It's thinking about, all right, we're a small team. How can we split things up? If I have two people handling financials, then I'm going to make sure one of those people is responsible for entering the data, and then the other person is responsible for reviewing it, right? And you could swap those people back and forth, but one person's doing one thing and the other one is going to be your oversight. So what you're doing is you're creating a separation of duties. And that's the most effective way that you're going to prevent fraud and mistakes, right? Because we're human and we make mistakes. We fat finger numbers, we enter things incorrectly. Another thing you want to have is like clear policies, right? So once again, it's not about having a novel length manual. It's about having clear, simple rules in place so that you know who can approve expenses, how a donation should be handled, and what to do if something's like off. It just doesn't seem right. And so you'd start with like a small set of written guidelines. And then as the company grows, you add to them, right? It doesn't have to be so formal and time consuming. And then another consideration is like a low cost like tech solution. They have some really affordable accounting tools out there, or like budgeting tools that could help with tracking income and expenses, or helping with your bank reconciliations, and they tend to be super user friendly. They don't break the bank. And then just even automating your bank recs, for example, could save a ton of time and reduce human error. And then also, like, a big component of a small organization is having regular check-ins. So you don't have a lot of staff, fine, but it's really important that you stay on top of things and you're regularly reviewing your financials. So think about like a monthly sit down. The two team members can sit together and go over the books. This looks weird, right? This is not right. And you're catching it sooner than later, right? So it's more about like using what you've got, staying organized, and keep it simple. You don't need like a whole department. You just need really clear procedures, regular check-ins, and you could help reduce risk that way.
And I would just say quickly too, not to shill ourselves out too much, but if there are any special projects or things within your organization that you want somebody to take a deeper look into, you could kind of outsource some of that and have somebody come in, review your policies and procedures, and work with you kind of on an ongoing basis to strengthen certain areas that you see vulnerabilities in.
Yeah, that's certainly something that we get called in to do all the time, right? Even if we're co-sourcing, right? We have this is what we've got. Can you help basically fill in the blanks? And that could be helpful as well.
What about leadership? I mean, we talk about, control environments and stuff, but what role does leadership play in that control environment? What role does leadership play in maybe helping to strengthen the controls in terms of, being a part of that control environment and really having a role within that control environment?
I think leadership is crucial when it comes to building, a culture of compliance and accountability within an organization. Like, you ever hear the tone at the top, right? Culture starts at the top, and your leader is who's setting the tone for everything. If a leader isn't practicing what they preach, basically, like, no one's going to follow suit, right? That's just human nature. Leaders need to lead by example. If the big bosses are following all the rules, if they're being transparent and they're holding themselves accountable, that sends a really strong message to everyone in the organization. If there's a CEO of a nonprofit and they're openly discussing how they're making sure donor funds are being spent, right? We want to make sure that they're being spent wisely. That encourages everyone else to be mindful, right? Just the same. And it has to do also with communication, right? So it's not about just the leaders knowing everything and everyone else is in the dark. You want them to communicate clearly and also share the importance of compliance. If they're just sitting back and quietly hoping that everyone follows the rules, that's not enough, right? They need to actively talk about it. You could do it during team meetings. You could do it through emails, casual conversations. It has to do with the culture and not just checking a box, I would say. And then also, how about providing training? That's like a big part of it, right? So it's up to a leader to make sure that everyone understands the rules, but also why they're important. So it's not just follow this policy, but teaching the people what the purpose of the policy is for, right? How it helps further the mission of an organization. So it's all about, like, modeling behavior, communicating how important something is, and then also giving everyone the tools and training to make sure that compliance and accountability is basically like built into the DNA of an organization.
Yeah. Another big thing with that is, like you said, if you don't have the tone at the top, they're not going to invest the resources in the preventative controls, and they're going to, well, not, they might not always, but there's a possibility they're just going to bleed cash, or there's going to be issues if they don't see the importance of internal controls and distributing that throughout the organization.
Yeah, again, if you think about it, the internal control environment is super important, because what it does is it provides some comfort overall that the information, everybody knows today that information is super important, that the information that's coming into the leadership that is being used to make decisions is good information, whether that's fiscal information, whether that's IT information, whether that's units of service, whether that's inventory, whatever it happens to be. If you don't have controls and you have a breakdown in controls, you typically have a breakdown of information. And
Right.
then that typically leads to bad decision making.
Mm-hmm.
So,
100%.
what are some of the red flags that you guys see out there, and what can organizations kind of do to kind of mitigate some of that?
So red flags, are so important. If you, for example, like if you saw a leak, right? If you had a leak in your roof, you're not going to ignore something like that because you know it's coming, right? So same thing with a red flag. You see something, do something, look into something, and one of the things that we look for when we come into an organization, while we're looking around trying to understand what the process is, we're interviewing people, we're observing, right? One of the first things we look for is, and we discussed it before, lack of segregation of duty. You're looking for opportunity, right? One person that has their hands in everything. You don't want a person who's processing payments to also be approving new vendors. You'd also look for things like poor or missing documentation, right? Someone's asking for reimbursement or approval, but they can't give you a receipt. They can't give you an invoice. They can't justify their expenses. That's a red flag. If you can't get clear records for things from expenses to donations, if documentation starts disappearing, that's a red flag. I would look into that. If you're looking at your invoices and the invoices aren't very detailed, right? They're very unspecified. You're missing documents, evidence of backdated documents. These are all things. I mean, could there be a reason? Of course, but it's a red flag. It's something that's worth looking into. Um, Questionable or missing signatures would be another one. Or unexplained or irregular transactions. That's something that I would look into. So, like something we might go into an organization, for example, and get a dump of journal entries, let's say, for the year. And all we're doing is looking at what time of day they're being done and what day of the week they're being done. And if you see that it's happening on holidays or Saturdays or midnight, and that's not relevant to the type of organization you have, that's worth looking into, right? So anything that seems irregular or offbeat is a red flag. That's something that you should 100% look, further into. Trying to think.
What's your thought on uh, cross training people so that someone's doing someone's job while they're away on vacation?
Yeah, that's a big one, right? You have that employee that's never missed a day, and yeah, they could love their job. But at the same time, why? Who doesn't want a vacation? Are they afraid that if they leave and someone steps in, something might be uncovered, right? So something as simple as that could be a red flag. And yeah, cross training, that's something that helps, like, to Adam's point before, business continuity. At any point, someone could win the lottery, right? And up and leave. And what happens then? Does everything stop? Cross training is a great way to mitigate that kind of risk because you have someone who could step in the event of a lottery winning or a health issue or, any kind of leave. And it's also good just to swap every once in a while for the purpose of uncovering possible fraud if you have any suspicions, in that regard. But another thing is people acting questionable, right? So when we go in and we do our interviews, if we notice that someone's really shifty or they're asking, they're acting kind of sketchy when we ask them basic questions, something might be off. Why? They could be nervous because the auditor's there. That's something, right? The auditor's here. But like sometimes, those kinds of like behaviors could be a red flag and worth looking into.
And I would just add on one other thing too, is we've seen kind of like an over reliance on kind of manual controls rather than automated. So that it's kind of like, going outside of the system to do certain things.
Yeah.
Like health benefit deductions. A lot of, different systems have where you could set up limits to limit the total amount that's going to be deducted from a person's pay. for the benefits. And we've seen that a lot of the times, instead of putting those limits into the system, there's just a spreadsheet that's maintained to calculate it and determine the maximum amount. And then, people don't even end up looking at the maximum amount that's calculated and doing a reconciliation to the system. So another important thing is just to use the system when you can, right? It's a red flag. It's an issue if you're going outside of the system to do all these calculations when the system has the capability to do it.
Yeah, anytime you're dealing with increased manual interaction within the process, there's a greater chance of error within that process. So again, we're not just talking about, fraud here. We're also talking about error. And when you kind of think about it, it's errors and irregularities, and you want to try to cover for both of those.
Yeah. And another one,
sorry, go ahead.
go ahead. No, I was going to say one that people don't think about is employee morale. If you walk into an organization and you get the feeling that people are dissatisfied, or they feel like their concerns are ignored, or that they're being treated poorly, I mean, that's a risk, right? You could have increased turnover, lower productivity in your organization. You could look at ethical and compliance risks, possible legal issues, and reputational damage. So that's another thing that we would look for.
And that goes also back to what you were saying before, having poor tone at the top. Having that poor tone at the top sets a strong internal control tone at the top, sets in strong internal controls. Weak internal control tone at the top sets weak internal controls throughout. So somebody asked a question, do you have suggestions implementing mandatory time off and coverage as checks and balances with small number of staff? So if someone has a small number of staff, are there any recommendations on implementing mandatory time off and coverage, or are there other things that people can do in order to kind of mitigate risk?
I feel like that's something that would definitely be unique to the organization, right? So it's knowing how to continue when that person's not there. So it's probably something that you'd have to plan for, right? Thinking, you'd have to have a good understanding of the process and what's needed to continue, and figuring out how to fill the gaps appropriately while they're out. So, and then making,
I was going to say, I think some of it also comes down to also if you have good oversight in a smaller organization at maybe the controller or CEO level, maybe it's not as big a deal with that person having to take time off or whatever, because if you are looking at transactions, you are doing a review of payroll or whatever it happens to be, you'll be able to catch something if something's wrong anyway, so it may not be as pertinent.
Yeah. And to Adam's point, right, the cross training.
Right. That's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
So that's, you can't force people to take off, but yeah, you could cross train, and you could maybe rotate job responsibilities for like a week or two out of the year to evaluate how well they're cross trained. And then at that time when, different people are doing different jobs, they might discover something, that the previous person did, incorrectly, or in the worst case, if there was fraud in the way the other person was doing that area.
And a follow-up question, in a small organization, how broadly can or should non-fiscal staff be part of the internal control environment?
So, there are internal controls that have nothing to do with finances at all, right? But they definitely help manage risks to an organization, regardless. So like we talked about reputational damage, for example, there are internal controls in place that might manage the customer service within your organization, right? And if you don't have good customer service, if you don't have controls in place to make sure that you're getting back to your donors, or you're not getting, or your clients, your customers, or whatever, you risk reputational damage. If you don't have internal controls in place to protect the privacy of your donors, right? That's not necessarily financial, but that can be a huge risk to an organization. So I think it's about understanding your organization, understanding all of the key processes in place, and how those controls, whether they're financial, whether they're quality control type internal controls, I think everyone could get involved, right? And I don't think it's just financial.
How do internal audits support financial integrity and operational efficiency and stability?
So internal audit's cool. I like to call us the good auditors. You have the scary auditors, right? We're the good fairy auditors, I tell everyone. And we come in and it's about detecting and preventing fraud, sure. It's about catching errors. We could come in and you know, things happen, right? Invoices get paid twice, a donation gets recorded incorrectly, and we could help find those small errors. But it's not so much about, and we could catch them early, right? Before they become something big. But it's also, even if the number is right, it's how did we get to the number? And is the process working? Is the internal control there? And so we could come in and be basically the eyes and ears of your audit committee, of your board, right? Because it's really your board who is tasked with the oversight of internal controls. And then it's management who's in charge of managing those internal controls. But we get to come in and be the eyes and ears of your board and say, hey, this is working or this is not working, you know, and this is how you can fix it. And you know, and it's looking at all different aspects of the organization. It's not just financial, it could also be operational, right? We can help improve efficiencies lots of times. Right, Adam, we come in and we can find almost money for an organization because they might be doing it, you know, the way that they always have. And there's a much more efficient way to do it, or, you know, a less risky way to do it. And we find money, right? We had one audit where there were many errors within separation payments. And we were able to come in and revamp that whole process, help them rebuild it so that that doesn't happen. And they had lost a lot of money. It's very hard to claw back money from an employee who's already left, right? So lots of times internal audits can, you know, kind of in a sense, make you money or help you recover money. We can also help, to Adam's point, with policies, procedures, helping you build that framework. And then we can also come in and do like full audits. I had done for an organization, a university actually, where I did a complaint process audit. And that's the thing where internal auditors can be strategic partners. We can help you when you're looking to make those big decisions, right? And we could come in and give you that unique independent viewpoint, right, of what you're looking to do. And one of them that I did was a complaint process audit. And that's not something that you would really think about when you think about auditing, but it was really cool. And what it was focused on was the reputational risk of a university. So I had to come in and first identify all the types of complaints that might happen at a university. And it could be like, my chicken nuggets were cold, to my dorm is hot, to harassment, right? To I hate my professor. It could be anything. And figuring out and identifying what all of those issues were, and then all the different places where they could come in, and then helping the university figure out how do we centralize those, you know, working on their website to make sure they had a central intake point, getting an ombudsman, I would say that wrong, in place to help with the intake of complaints and knowing where they need to go, right? The intake being automatically, to your point, Adam, directed to the various departments using certain keywords and whatnot, and then customer service training, escalation protocols, things along those lines. Because if you think about it, if someone, especially in today's day on social media, is talking, you know, about the chicken nuggets at blah, blah, blah university and the fact that no one's receptive when they can't figure out their bill, that could really harm an institution. So internal audit could be definitely a dynamic role. It could be very strategic and useful in many ways, I would say.
And just quickly sorry, I know we're running low on time, but quickly to that point, you know, about internal audit being cooperative, you know, we also, whenever we go into an organization and interview the employees, we ask them about like their wants and needs. You know, sometimes management may not be as responsive if it comes from the employees. You know, if there's another outside party also telling management, look, this is what people need, this is where there's problems, you know, they might be a little bit more receptive. So that's a way that we could help organizations as well through our reports.
Yeah, I mean, Erin, one of the things you talked about was like compliance related issues and stuff like that. And what I tell people all the time is, look, if if there is a compliance related issue, you'd rather hear it from us than a government auditor coming in and kind of looking at things. So, I mean, that's another place where from that perspective, it works. We're a little over on time. I apologize, everyone, that we have. That wraps up today's Cerini Connection. Thank you all for joining us. Huge thank you to Erin and Adam. That was amazing. That was great. That was fantastic. You guys did awesome. We don't have our next topic for March. We'll be announcing that soon. We're kind of trying to nail down our speaker. Just also a quick reminder, the Imagine Awards are coming up on April 29th, the Crest Hollow, the Long Island Imagine Awards 13th annual. Finalists have already announced. And so you can visit imagineawards.li.com for more information, to buy tickets, be in the room. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you again next month. Take care.